I tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, I've really enjoyed these sort of inspirational talks that we've interspersed with the panel discussion, because, you know, starting with Anna this morning and her wonderful restaurant in Slovenia, through to Amy and her work with biodiversity, with flora and fauna in Virginia, it really is, I suppose, making real-life examples of what we're all talking about today, how to find land management and food production systems that work for everybody, work for us all human beings who want to eat food, enough food to keep us all content, happy, and alive, but also managed in a way that is good for the soil, good for clean waters, good for biodiversity. The demands upon us and the way we handle our natural world and our food production are immense. They're enormous. They're difficult. And today we've been wrestling with how best to cope with the difficult challenges. This last panel is actually about something that matters a great deal and is deeply practical. It's about the money. It's about funding. It's about how to make all these good ideas and good intentions real with money. So let me invite to the stage my panel. We'll get straight to some brief remarks from all the panelists, a discussion. I definitely want you involved because it's the last session, so you can be as controversial and provocative as you like. Believe me, I'm all for provocation. The overall overarching theme is how to fund this transition. It couldn't be a simpler question. And to deal with it, let me invite onto the stage and give them all a round of applause when they've all gathered. Mary Whitto, who is the Principal Consultant on Sustainable Agri-Food at the Anthesis Group, which is a consultancy. Oh, you're clapping early, but hang on a second. Chris Hogg, who is Global Head of Public Affairs for Nestle. Boris Erg, who is Director at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in their European office. Alessandro Cataldo, who is a partner and the Head of Transaction Strategy and Execution at EY Parthenon. He also happens to be a farmer, so he's wearing two hats today. And Martin Rissink, who is advisor to the board on food and agri matters at Rabobank, handling EU food and agribusiness at Rabobank. So please give a very warm welcome to all of our panel. Hello, panel.
Thank you.
Now, we have limited time, and I want you all to kick off by giving me an opening thought on this very basic and fundamentally important question: how to fund the transition, which has been the subject of so much discussion today. It's all about the money. And obviously, you know, we've talked about the public monies coming from governments, coming from the collective of the European Union. We've talked about public-private partnerships to a certain extent. We've talked about specific funds for innovation. We've talked about the burden that sits with farmers who have to produce the food and have to cope with a financial landscape which in recent years has been very difficult for them. So there are all sorts of different ways of handling this. You each come at this from your own particular perspective. How to fund this transition? Mary, you start with your opening thoughts.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's great to be here today. As you said, my name is Mary Whitto. I'm from Anthesis. Anthesis is a sustainability consultancy with a large focus on food and agriculture, supporting clients across the world. At the end of last year, we published a paper for Food Drink Europe on funding the EU transition to more sustainable agriculture, and it looked at what it might cost and how it might be funded. But firstly, when we think of the question of how to fund the transition, we need to know how much. But we also need to understand that trying to calculate a single figure for transitioning all EU farms is incredibly difficult. You know, we've got factors such as different landscapes and climates across the EU. You've got different farming types. You've got the different kind of willingness to implement these changes. You've got different states of agriculture. And you've also got the amount of funding available at national level, all having an impact. So when we approached this question in our paper, we looked for something that was measurable, relevant to every EU member state, and something that could be used as a robust indicator for sustainable agriculture. And this brought us to soil health. Now, soil is responsible for around 95% of all food produced in the EU. It's one of the most effective carbon sinks on the planet, and it can be tested relatively inexpensively by farmers on the ground. Soil health data is also in some ways being collected already, so there's a baseline to build on. So one of the most important takeaways, or the first takeaway, is that soil health is a very good metric, and it's, I think, quite key to calculating these costs, or it is one method. And by focusing on soil health, we have the potential to create a wide-scale and effective transition. So we concluded that the cost for the first year of an EU-wide transition based on improved soil health would be in the region of 28 to 35 billion euros. Now, this cost is large. Yes, there's no escaping that. But the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. The EU has already estimated that soil degradation costs around 50 billion euros per year. And the FAO has estimated that soil damage has the potential to reduce crop yields by up to 10% by 2050 if nothing is done. So in these contexts, 28 to 35 billion euros seems a little bit more reasonable, but I'm sure there will be disagreement. But finally, the question of who pays. Now, in the paper, we picked out a number of different potential funding mechanisms across both public and private sectors that could support this transition. Each one, of course, has its pros and cons, and there's certainly no silver bullet. But the most important thing is that it must be a blend of different options. This transition cannot be financially supported by just one single actor. It must involve everyone from the farmers to the food and drink industry to government to private investors, even potentially consumers. And by collaborating at scale, we firstly have the opportunity to de-risk this transition, or certainly share some of that risk. Secondly, to share very valuable knowledge and expertise. And finally, hopefully, if we collaborate at scale, we can ensure greater influence at a policy level, to ensure change happens more quickly. But this topic is incredibly broad. We've heard so many different things today, and very, very interesting. And as I said, there's no perfect answer. But we're also not starting from scratch. There's a lot of work that's already being done by farmers and others in the sector. But we now need to make sure that progress is really being made at the pace and scale required.
One thing you also need to ensure that different aspects of the food production system aren't working against each other. Did your analysis of what would be the great benefit of focusing on soil health also consider whether certain other aspects of the European scene might be damaging soil health, certain aspects of the CAP, for example, which costs more than 50 billion euros a year to the European Union, and perhaps some of its priorities and some of its assumptions aren't particularly helpful when it comes to ensuring soil health. Did you consider some of those internal, perhaps, contradictions?
Something particularly that kind of comes to mind, but I think that we have to be very careful that policy is promoting soil health.
But it's all joined up.
Yes, and it's all joined up. We looked specifically at sort of a combination of different practices, including cover crops and reducing tillage. But I think the risk is, as said, it does come at a cost. So I think the risk is that we disincentivize farmers from taking up these practices. And that we put the onus on them, I think. And certainly from our paper, we were really strong on the fact that it shouldn't be down to the farmers. This should be, the cost should be carried by lots of people in the sector and different stakeholders, but really with a focus on taking the cost away from the farmers.
Good. Well, thank you very much for that, Mary. That's very interesting. Chris, let's get to you. We haven't heard so much today from the private sector. You're global head of public affairs at Nestle, one of the biggest food producers in Europe, I dare say in the world. So give us your perspective on funding and where a vast multinational company like yours might be involved. Should be involved, must be involved.
Is involved.
Is involved. Explain.
Is already investing, is already spending money on regenerative agriculture, on delivering a climate roadmap. So is already spending today. My answer would be very similar really to what Mary is saying. It's a shared responsibility. There are 300,000 food companies in Europe. I speak for Nestle, not for the rest of them. but it's a responsibility that we take seriously. We are already funding the efforts in these areas. But the truth,
this is all about the nitty-gritty of money. How much? Can you give us some sense of how much you're committing?
Yeah, so for example, we've committed 1.2 billion Swiss francs between now and 2025 to deliver our commitment of getting 20% of our raw materials, agricultural raw materials, from regenerative agriculture. But it's, what I was just going to go on to say was, we won't get the value out of those investments as a society if we can't scale them up. And if we're going to scale them up, that's where it comes back to what's been discussed all day, really, which is making sure that policymakers deliver a stable environment. Whether you're a big company like Nestle or whether you're a small farmer, you're being asked to take a gamble. You're being asked sometimes to change the way that something has been done, not just for a few years, but for generations. And so you have to install a sense of confidence. And confidence comes from a stable policy environment, because we're asking people to come up with nature-based solutions, which are not just for 3 or 4 years, for a contract. As somebody said last night, they're for generations. And so stability and confidence is really what we need to move from these pilots and early proof of concept type things into something that's really scalable.
How do you persuade your shareholders that they need to be part of that longer term thinking, and that they need to perhaps wean themselves off the sort of short-term shareholder return mentality and think much bigger picture, much longer term?
Well, first of all, Nestle is 155 years old. So it's sort of baked into the DNA of our company to have a long-term sustainable approach. People who buy the Nestle shares tend to buy them. They're the kind of people that want that kind of stability. The other thing, which is increasingly the case, is that a few years ago, this was the kind of discussion you would only have with ESG investors. But now you're having them increasingly with mainstream investors, because they are trying to de-risk their investment. And they see the risk of the risks that climate change will bring, say, to yields and to the coffee that we buy. So they see it as making sense. The reality is, and Nestle always says, we have to be the and company. We have to deliver for the long term, but we also obviously have the pressure of, we have a set of competitors, we have to deliver for the short term too. So the secret is getting it right, being able to create the conditions and to create the projects which allow you to be more resilient as a company when it comes to sustainability, but at the same time doing it in such a way and using technology and above all partnerships, working with others to make sure you can do it as efficiently as possible.
All right, Chris, thank you very much indeed. Boris, I'm going to invite you to give us your opening thoughts on the base question, how to fund this transition. And just to remind everybody, you're at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, so you go for it.
Sure, thanks a lot for that. I mean, first of all, to say that it's a real pleasure to be here. I mean, sort of honor, you know. We've been sort of, you know, saying that and getting across that message that biodiversity is part of the mix, and yet haven't been seeing it that much at the fore. So now we are part of it. So this is a big honor for us. At the same time, is great responsibility. We've heard today, kind of, you know, sort of putting value on nature. It's a tricky business. I mean, it's not that easy, and it's not possible always. Yeah, but I mean, at least to understand that the environment at large is part of all this discussion is very important. I was really taken by the applause that was given to this win-win solutions of working with farmers, with people on the ground in trying to find solutions. Before discussing how to fund the transition, it probably one step back is to say, do we agree on transition? Yeah, so I think that's a big question, and participating in these discussions, I think that there is a large consensus that there is a need for transition. I won't be bringing up numbers in terms of nature and the decline of nature, but they are just striking, kind of, that span 30 to 50, 60% of those that are very, very indicators to health systems and basically land and support systems that we live on and live off. And that are in dire straits, simply saying. So we are not saying that just to kind of, say biodiversity is declining, but also to say that basically the whole system is in a very, very a peculiar moment. So from that perspective, there is a need for transition. So how to fund it? So, I mean, simple saying, we need all hands on deck. We need public, we need private, we need blended, we need innovation in that regard. There are few things that IUCN is also contributing with. One of them, for example, it's already mentioned nature-based solutions. IUCN is one of the organizations behind the idea of nature-based solutions, just to see how we can integrate nature. Yeah. So we will be talking later on a little bit more in detail where to start and how to move on with that transition. But definitely we need a good and smart combination of public and private, and then of course kind of that value distribution. Just one last note on nature finance gap, as we call it. We estimated is around a 700 billion a year. But when we start unpacking, then we see that it's not just about a finance for nature, just a funding or investment into nature conservation, but it also kind of can be broken down into a funding for nature, can be also looked into a little bit into a harmful subsidies and so on and so on. So I think that unpacking also helpful just to understand basically where to invest or where not to invest or redirect investment that already exists. So we can also kind of generate some money and pool some money by not doing something that we are doing at present.
Do you, Boris, do you see a fundamental sort of mindset change when you talk to policymakers, public policymakers, people in government, and when you talk to people like Chris, who represent a major food producer, a corporate player? Chris was saying, listen, it's not just a sort of bit of an ESG obsession for some of our shareholders anymore. It's something that is a prevalent thought throughout our shareholder group, throughout the company. This is just a part of what we do now. Do you buy that? Do you see this mentality shift at all levels, public and private?
Well, to be honest, I would say yes and no. I mean, because it's not just that easy to say, kind of, and straightforwardly. But I do see a change in understanding and awareness. That's for sure. Kind of even within the conservation community, like 10 years ago and now, there is a big shift. It's a different take. It's a different approach. I see a lot of nodding when we are having this discussion. So I don't think that we are any longer discussing whether. We really move to the how, and that's of course where the rubber hits the road, and that's where it's complex, and there where it's kind of changes, disruption, and then it's where anxiety comes in. But in terms of having that awareness that there is an urgent need to do something, I would say that I'm on that end I'm quite positive.
When you said, I see a lot of nodding, I thought, oh my God, that means half the audience has nodded off. But I'm hoping that is not the case. No need for that, ladies and gentlemen, because this discussion I'm finding already is fascinating. And we've got great perspectives. We've got another perspective here. And this is interesting, because Alessandro, as I introduced you, not only are you a senior player at EY, although it's EY Parthenon, I'm not quite sure how I understand how Ernst Young, which I'm very familiar with, is a major sort of accountancy, consultancy group around the world. You're a little part of them which is called Parthenon, which sounds very classical and posh, but how do you relate to the rest of EY? Not only that, though, you're a farmer. So you're doing two full-on jobs at the same time, and you're here to tell us what you think about funding this sort of fundamental transition in food production systems. So you've got a lot on your plate. Explain how you do it.
Thanks, Stephen. And first of all, thank you for having me here as well. This is my first participation at the forum, and very glad to be here. As a farmer, I actually feel honored to actually lead the agricultural practice for EY. EY Partner is actually the strategy and M&A part of EY that focuses on providing strategic advice and transaction advice.
But not just in agriculture.
Not in agriculture.
But you're handling agriculture.
So I also lead the sector basically in Europe within agri-food. Now agri-food is important because what we're seeing is we need, in order to drive change, we really need to look at the entire value chain from farm to fork, or actually as we say now, from fork to farm, because consumers are now starting to drive the priorities for us as farmers as well, and we're starting to see that trickling down the value chain. Now, you're probably thinking, why is EY involved in agriculture? And, and of course we support, our, let's say, governmental clients, the public sector as well as the private sector, across all the phases of the value chain in their transformation. But actually we got into agriculture because of our purpose. We set ourselves an objective to positively impact 1 billion lives by 2030. And it's very difficult to do unless...
Just run that by me again. The object to impact 1 billion lives...
Positively by 2030. And of course, agriculture and food give you a potent lever to do that, because you can affect climate, you can affect food security, and also you can affect farmers' incomes. And I think that is a very noble part of our CSR program as well, that we try to live throughout what we do. I've been involved in particular in the regenerative, or in setting the regenerative agriculture agenda, starting from COP27, where we worked to pull together actually a coalition of the willing, if you want to say that, from the private sector, the public sector, from the universities and research institutes, to help provide a definition. What is it, regenerative agriculture? What is sustainable agriculture? And in particular, to ensure that there is a strong science-based thinking rather than opinions behind it as well. And the work is in progress, and I think we've taken big strides in this. In COP28, we actually focused on the topic of how do we finance the transition. And here I want to focus on why financing is important. If we want to transition to regenerative agriculture, farmers basically will have to make a major investment, not only in terms of machinery and knowledge, which will be required to support the practices that underpin regenerative agriculture, but also they will face a yield loss. And there are two elements of that. The first element is the yield loss that comes from transitioning from conventional farming to regenerative agriculture. And just to keep things simple, if on conventional farming I'm able to achieve 10 tons of yield per hectare in cereals, under regenerative I'm probably running at about 8 tons. To give an example, under organic agricultural practices, I'm probably limiting myself to even 6 tons per hectare. The key question is, do we get a premium in price for such a product? And that is difficult to achieve today in the current food systems that we are operating to. The other problem is it takes a relatively long time for soils to stabilize to the next level of, let's say, stability. It used to be about 8 years to 10 years to actually restore your carbon content in soils. Thanks also to work that CGIAR did and many other research institutes, we're starting to see now an acceleration of that period to potentially even 4 years. But still, many farmers, they cannot afford a rapid decrease in yields until their soils start restoring themselves and bring you to that next stable yield level as well.
But if I may, this is precisely why, well, it's one of the reasons why so many farmers in so many different parts of Europe are deeply discontented and indeed angry right now, because they feel they're being instructed to do all these things which, are related to more regenerative farming. That is, they're supposed to cut their use of pesticides dramatically, quickly. They're supposed to cut their use of fertilizers dramatically, quickly. It's going to have an impact on yields. It's going to have an impact on their incomes. Their incomes are low anyway. They're really struggling. And now they're being told, you've got to do much more. Absolutely. And they feel the burden is all on them. And this whole debate is about how we ensure that the burden isn't entirely on them. And I'm just wondering whether you, as a farmer, as well as a sort of consultant, feel that the farmers right now really have a point. It is unfair the way this thing is being rolled out. I
think it's more, I'll probably say unfair is not the right term. It's frustration, because think about it. Until now, as farmers, we've been asked to grow more with less. And of course, science has helped a lot. I mean, you saw probably, some of the graphs that were presented earlier on today showing the increasing productivities that we had at farm level. Now we're being asked to grow more with less sustainably, and to make major investments to be able to achieve that, and also accepting yield loss. And the question is, how are we going to finance that? I mean, the farmers don't have the disposable income to finance this. We heard before, well, we can increase prices, but the reality is our consumers cannot afford more expensive food. Our food has to be healthy, affordable, and in particular when we go through economic hard times, families have to take hard decisions about what they put on the tables. Governments are not in a better position either to finance such a transition.
This is the bind we are in.
Absolutely. And the industry has to deliver profits as well. I mean, this is what is being demanded of them as well. So the conclusion that we came to at COP28 is that, well, maybe we need to think about this in a different way. And we need to think about, are the farmers a problem, or can they be part of the solutions as well? And one of the things that is clear is that because of the potential the soils have to act as very potent carbon sinks, we have an opportunity to actually think about regenerative agriculture as a way to leverage those carbon sinks to actually, free up a value that can be monetized through the value chain as well, either directly by the farmer through carbon credits, but also in terms of the benefits that you get through regenerative agriculture, in terms of reduced crop inputs that you may be able to achieve as well. And this is something that I think has started to change the mentality there. And because of this, we see it is a complex problem that needs what I call a multi-stakeholder approach to solving. We need the industry, we need the financial institutions, we need the farmers, we need the science, and we need the governments to help us solve it together. And I really welcome what I heard today about really starting the dialogue, the strategic dialogue, which I think will lead us there as well.
Well, you mentioned the financial institutions. Mr. Financial Institution is sitting right next to you. Embodied, I'm delighted to say, in the form of Martin Riesink, who is at Rabobank as an advisor to the board on food and agri in the European Union. Martin, you speak for a financial institution, so give us your perspective on funding the transition.
Yes, thank you. Very nice to be here and to speak about that topic, of course. Good to know that Rabobank is a food and ag bank globally, and we want to work on a better world, growing a better world together. So we want to invest in restoring nature and to act on climate, so to say. And we are developing within the bank on 4 enablers, so to say. We want to develop a lot of knowledge about food and ag. We want to develop financial solutions, so to say. We also want to be innovative. So we have, for example, the Rabo Carbon Bank to develop innovative solutions, not only for farmers here, but also in Africa. And we also want to work together in partnerships, collaboration, because that's very important to come to solutions.
Do you, if I may be blunt, do you also want to lend money at favourable rates to young farmers, which is a thing that a lot of banks simply don't want to do?
Yes, we do in the Netherlands. And for example, what's important to finance and transition, you do know to understand that transition. And for example, we like to look at regenerative agriculture. We want to do that with the farmers, with the science, with the big corporates, to see how we can build together a solution. For example, Rabobank is that doing, I can tell it because it's open, with McCain on the potato base, to see how we can do in the northern part of Europe, build a model, a collaboration model between farmers, the input suppliers, McCain, all have to do their best, so to say. McCain can give a long-term off-taker agreement, a premium. We can say, hey, you are doing very good business as a farmer, you are sustainable, so you get a reduction on the premium. And if you count all that pluses, yeah, then it's possible for a farmer to do it. And yeah, he gets support from the corporate on knowledge. They can also, the farmers can speak with each other to tell, hey, how are we doing things? So that's important to look at.
I mean, in the past, I think financial institutions have looked at investing in agriculture and have seen a lot of risk, and they haven't really wanted to engage too much with that level of uncertainty and risk that they saw in agriculture for all sorts of different reasons. Do you think, I mean, this is now opening up to everybody, that when we're talking about financial instruments and new ways of funding transition, that there are effective ways now of dealing with risk which work and which are being used?
Yeah, I think it is important to see that if a farmer is looking at his farm dashboard to say, is my soil healthy? What is my impact on biodiversity? What can I do for inputs? That we have reliable data, and that's helpful for the farmer, and that's helpful also for a financial institution to see how it is developing. So I think that's a very important thing. And also in the discussion, we work closely together with Mary in Food Drink Europe in that report to give input. And what we also see is that you have to incentivize the entrepreneurship of the farmer. Don't write down what kind of practices he shall do. No, tell him you have to serve, it's better for you to have a healthy soil because your yield is rising. So you have to look at the outcomes and incentivize him to build his farming model to have better outcomes, so to say. So if you, for example, that's one of the things we're speaking about then with the European Commission. Hey, you can do a lot of writing down all kinds of practices you have to do, but please don't do it in that way. Give the right incentives so that you are looking at the outcomes. And we developed a tool as Rabobank, for example, together with WWF, with the Wageningen University, with Friesland Campina. We call it the Biodiversity Monitor. Science-based, so we have really data to see how sustainable such a farm is, and we can check that with our risk model. So if the farmer is on the right way for sustainability, measured by that tool, we can give him a reward, so to say, or a reduction.
Just one more question from me, and then I want to open it up to our brilliant audience. We've talked about you and the financial institutions and your current attitude to, being very proactively involved in investing in regenerative agriculture, transitioning food systems. So we've talked about the banks. We've certainly talked a lot today about governments, from collective EU action to national government policy. What we haven't talked so much about is the consumer, the individual. And if we're talking about funding the transition, do we need to be honest and say, consumers are going to be funding the transition as well, because pricing is going to change, and certain foodstuffs in particular, like, for example, meat, for example, is going to become more expensive as a part of this transitioning to a more sustainable food production system. Chris, I might pick on you just because obviously your company cares a great deal about consumers and about pricing and about, finding the right way to encourage consumers to consume your products. Is the consumer a part of this discussion about funding the transition?
The consumer is always at the center of everything we do, so it's a good question. I think when it comes down to it, the reality is that what we see today, it's whether you are talking about developed or even developing countries, it's hard at the moment to see much evidence that consumers are willing to pay more for more sustainable products. I think, though, as we go forward, consumers are just going to divide us into two camps, those that get it and those that don't get it. So, and especially with the generations that are coming through, who've got really, really strong views on this, and so are going to be looking at us And to be honest with you, sometimes within the company, when people are looking at the investment that we need to make in this area, you know, and people are sort of questioning and saying, can we get value out of this in terms of marketing campaigns and things like this? Part of the problem is that where we're getting to is just where consumers expect us to be. So you know, you can't have a big splash and say, this is amazing, therefore you should buy our product, because they would expect you to be doing that anyway. The reality is that consumers pay for value. They will buy your product if they value that product. And value comes down to, you know, the quality of your ingredients, the taste, whether it's more nutritious, and also more sustainable. But you know, are you going to be able to fund all of the costs of the transition through raising your prices? Absolutely not, because affordability is key. And with the cost of living crisis, affordability there isn't much elasticity there. So what does that mean? That means that we have to look at ways to deliver the transition and to deliver everything else which is expected of a company like ourselves, but by being smarter and more innovative. And you know, if you take AI, you know, you can use AI now to scan our recipe base and to do a job in a couple of hours that used to take sort of 3 people 6 weeks. So the more that you can come up with things like this, that's where the funding will come to make this to fund the transition.
Great, thank you. Now, we've got at least 10 minutes where I can open this up. I can take any sort of question you like, challenging, provocative, whatever you want. We've got a great panel here, and we're talking about money and about funding a transition. There are people, you know, I know in the audience who feel that, particularly the farming community, doesn't get enough of a voice, and its interests aren't properly represented at forums like this, so please feel free to speak now. Great, we've got some arms up, so actually, ma'am, I'm going to start with you, if there is a microphone near the front, and then I'll come to you gentlemen over there, but you go, you go for it, ma'am.
Anne-Sophie Gamborg from Denmark. It's very interesting to hear all the possibilities there are to work with these things, but it's really, really hard to see the solutions that's going to really work for us farmers. I'm a farmer in Denmark, and we are super willing to do all these things, and I also said we are able and willing, but last year, and I'm just saying, who's going to pay? That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing we're talking about. And nobody dares to say the consumer, because you say the consumer can't see the value of this. No, but then maybe we need legislation. Maybe we need to say there are some foods that are not good for us, they're not good for the environment, they're not good for so many things. Well, they've got to be more expensive. Then make this super healthy, super good food super cheap. Then we could already make a big change in this. But there's one big thing here. How can we also, we had a nice American gentleman saying, let's keep the trade open. So how are we going to change all this in Europe? Have all these great ideas in Europe, put all these extra costs on everybody in Europe, and then we just import shitty, cheap products from abroad? Yes. Come with the solutions, please.
These are really great questions. You should be presenting the Hard Talk show. You'd be very good. Who on the panel would like to take on those very pressing questions?
I can start.
Yeah, good. Well, yeah, let's start at that end. So, Martin, you go for it, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I think that trade is of course very important. Some products you cannot produce in Europe, so to say, so you have to bring them from outside Europe. But what, in my opinion, or in our opinion as Rabobank, very important is that there is a global level playing field. So you have to work on it. So
yeah, but there isn't a global level.
No,
so
but you have to work on it. So we joining also as a bank COP28. We are working on it. We also are for example, member of the World Business Council Sustainable Development.
Yeah, but while you're working on it, the question is, Europe, now are preoccupied with going down this transition route and taking all sorts of measures and asking farmers to do all sorts of things and adapting food systems. And if that's not happening in other major food-producing parts of the world, and their products are significantly cheaper, then these farmers in Europe who are jumping through all these hoops that are being required of them are put at a massive competitive disadvantage. And how do you explain that, justify that, and tell them that that's fair?
Yeah, if you say it in that way, then it's not fair, of course, huh? So that's not fair.
So then why should farmers want to participate in this? And then you've got a spiraling problem of non-cooperation, and that's why so many tractors are on so many streets across the European Union.
Yeah, well, I was at the conference of the Belgian presidency, and there was a story about free trade agreements, how we can work with quotas, with tariffs. And there are now tariffs. We ask for them if you produce, but it's not an easy solution for that question. That's true. That's true. But we have to work on it, so to say, to make a fair play for farmers in Europe. And that's
Mary, you've got thanks, Martin. That's candid. And Mary, you look like you wanted to.
I would almost sort of turn it around and say, yes, there is a cost to this transition, but if we don't transition, the costs aren't going to go away. And I'm not saying that the farmer should take on that cost, but hopefully, if the transition is implemented correctly and effectively, over time, costs should reduce. If, for example, soil health improves, then hopefully cost of inputs should reduce. And yes, it will take time, but hopefully the cost will reduce.
I mean, the farmer is going to need really serious help in that period of transition, because otherwise they'll be out of business by the by the time you've achieved this rebalancing. The poor old farmer's out of business.
Yeah. Well, I think sometimes there's quite a lot of emphasis put on public funds. We've got the cap, etc. But I mean, certainly from our cost estimates, if we just relied on cap, then that's not enough. And certainly in our research, there's a kind of growing focus on private funds coming into play, and from kind of whether it's VC or PE funds or whether it's banks or whatever. And I think hopefully that is another avenue or a kind of route of funding, a source of funding that can be galvanized to support this transition. And at the beginning, I said that collaboration is very, very important, and something that perhaps Chris can comment on. But bringing in private funding and industry together as well could be a very effective route to fund this further and support farmers. I mean, for example, there's a fund run by a big asset management firm called TKO Capital, and they have very recently set up a Regen Ag fund. Their aim is to have €1 billion in the pot, but they have partnered with both AXA, the insurance company, and Unilever. But the idea is that through that partnership, they can share expertise from the TKO's financial expertise. Unilever obviously has direct responsibility to its farmers and acts as expertise in sort of risk management. And so far, each one of them, I think, has put in €100 million to support the fund, and they're getting lots of other investors involved. But hopefully, that is a good example of where other funding sources can come from and can take the pressure away from
that's a good practical,
funds.
That's a good example. I'm going to rush a little bit because we don't have much time, and I did promise two gentlemen with their hands up. Let's get two questions at once. So you, sir, and then you further to the side. Yeah.
Monte Cuccoli, I'm a farmer from Austria. A very important post in agri-economy is the value of the land. And our experience is that with every labor and with every restriction on our land, like a Natura 2000 area or a nitrate action program or perhaps a nature restoration law or whatever, the value of the market value of my land is decreasing. I lose market value on my land. But the schemes, the subsidies, and all the other things just cover direct costs and loss of harvest. So my question is, how could we increase the market value of conservation land?
Okay.
At this moment, you will have a lot of landowners in the boat.
It's a great question, thank you. I'm going to make a note to myself, and I'm going to get the other question as well. You, sir, yep, you had your hand up, yep.
Thank you very much. My name's David Zarek. I'm probably known in this town mostly as the risk monger. We talked a lot about how brands are presenting their solutions for agriculture. Chris, you even mentioned that your first contacts were with your ESG investors. So I'm wondering, how much consultation do you actually do with farmers? And Martin, you mentioned how you're working with McCain, and McCain was doing wonderful things on regenerative agriculture. Regenerative is very good for ESG points, but McCain makes French fries. These are potatoes. How do you do no-till potatoes? Well, let me just share one little point. I spoke to about 200 farmers in Manitoba who were livid at how McCain was putting demands and stresses that they produce no-till potatoes, so McCain's ESG points can go up. Nobody was consulting the farmers.
Okay, so first on the panel, I want you to address the first question, which was basically about whether there's a problem for landowners here, that all of this discussion about the transition to more sustainable food production systems is in danger of devaluing land as an asset, which of course is a huge problem for the landowner and probably inclines the landowner to be less interested and less cooperative in this entire sort of chain of transition. So how do you address that problem?
Well, not really have an answer how to increase the value of land, but just wanted to back on and touching on that, of course, is that talking about this increase, the price at the end of the chain, we are not all of us farmers, but all of us are definitely consumers. So I think it's fair to say it's difficult to expect that the price will go down with all these values being incorporated in the product. So the question is whether there's willingness to pay for that. That's one thing.
Are you talking about the price of the fruit or the price of the land? I'm getting
the food, the product. But then the question is whether we should invest in building those values, because values are changing, not at pace and scale that we would love to see, but they are definitely changing, and some of them in very positive direction. The other one is basically then how then the farmer has how to give that return to the farmer. So how farmers have a good share in the price of the product. And so that's not really kind of, to increase the value of land, but it certainly kind of, if it increases the value of labor, which is sort of a thing that we can certainly do. And then finally, just to make a note that what I heard here is that frustration of leveraging so it's not just increasing the volume of money, because we discuss about how to fund the transition, but also is how to make it more functional. And in terms of, because it all, in lots of cases, it falls on the shoulders of small farmers, where margin for risk is very, very tiny, is basically how to simplify procedures and how to enable that much better access to knowledge and all these opportunities that might be existing out there. So those are the things that we can take as sort of an action point for ourselves, who are trying to provide some knowledge.
Okay. Alessandro, I just want you to take up the point about genuine consultation with farmers and taking farmers with you in terms of the new approaches. And the example was McCain. Was it you introduced McCain? Who was talking about McCain earlier? Oh, it was you. Yeah, it was you, Martin. Well, what's your response to what we just heard about farmers not being properly consulted?
Yeah, I cannot speak for McCain, of course, but if it's true what he's saying, then something is going wrong. Let's be clear.
Right. Well,
yeah, then it's
if
going
we've
wrong.
got any representative of McCain in the house, we should.
What I know, what my colleagues are doing in the Netherlands with McCain and the farmers is that they have on regular basis, they speak with each other. How are things going? Is it as promising as it was presented?
Yeah.
Is it helpful or not? And how are the yields going? So I started also in my first start here that collaboration, partnerships is so important to build that trust that everybody is looking at a win-win situation.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's been a message throughout the day. You've got to get all your I mean, I hate this jargon, stakeholders, but you've got to get all your stakeholders on the same page, lined up, believing in the same sort of things to make this transition work.
Yeah.
Chris, you had the look of a man who's about to say something. You're going to have to be brief because I'm afraid we're having time issues.
Yeah, I just wanted to say consultation is absolutely key. In this job, I've been lucky enough to go all over the world and meeting Nescafe farmers in Southeast China, dairy farmers in India, Indonesia. We have these young guys who are agronomists and are extensionists, and they are the ones that are working with these farmers. Interestingly, they often come from farming families themselves, because you know it comes much better from a farmer than from a British guy that sits in Switzerland.
Indeed, speaking as the son of a farmer, I would absolutely endorse that sentiment. Now, look, I'm feeling terribly guilty because there were 2 online questions which appeared on my screen, and I was thinking, I've got to do the online questions, and now they've disappeared. If I promise that we'll be really brief, can we just... there they are. Right, one's for you, Mary, but you've got to promise me to be super brief because we're running out of time. So, online question for Mary. Do you think that carbon farming could help give more importance to soils and help finance the transition? I must admit, I'm so ignorant. Is that this phrase "carbon farming"? What does that mean exactly?
Well, my understanding is that the sort of voluntary carbon market, and whether it's beneficial to create carbon credits, either insetting or offsetting.
Okay, so putting a really meaningful price on carbon and including that in your assessment of land management and
And it was carbon. The voluntary carbon market was included in our paper. And I'll be very brief. I think it's definitely got pros and cons. It's potentially a good mechanism for getting the money direct to farmers and hopefully cutting out too many intermediaries. However, I think I would also caution 2 things. Firstly, I think that there's potentially a risk with thinking that carbon credits are a bit of a silver bullet. I don't think they're the answer for everything with this transition. There's a risk with just focusing on carbon reduction as opposed to biodiversity, nature, water, etc. Also, it's still quite an unstable market. So I think there's still a lot of risk involved there.
Okay, we'll leave that one there. Thank you very much. And then finally for Alessandro, how do we convince landowners to go for long-term contracts on nature-based solutions when the truth is there aren't many examples of success in this area? Alessandro?
What a great question. And actually, I will also answer our colleague from Austria there at the same time. As a farmer, as farmers, we always have to take long-term decisions. I plant today grapevines that will come in production 3 years from now, and we'll start producing good wine in 5, 6 years from now. And against this, I need to have partners in the value chain that help me take these long-term positions. Yes, there are few examples out there, but they're growing. And I think the future is ready today here in small doses. We just need to look for it. Examples of integrated value chains where producers, food producers or converters actually enter in long-term supply contracts that help farmers actually adapt new agricultural practices with the knowledge that they're going to be able to supply for 8, 10, 15 years. It is absolutely fundamental here, not only to be able to take the right investment decisions, but in particular for smallholders who need the financing to be able to go to financing institutions and insurance companies and show commercial paper, which reduces the risk to the financial partners as well. So for me, this is great. And by the way, having or being in this kind of integrated value chains, it means that your land value goes up as well. Because all of a sudden, you're looking at a cash flow that is pretty much taking the risk away from the operator of the farm as well. So I think it's a great opportunity there, again, going back to this multi-stakeholder, systemic solutions that we need to really bring in place, bringing together the financial institutions, the industry, the farmers, the governments together to create this kind of integrated solutions.
That's the kind of positive vision I think we should end on, so Alessandro and my entire panel. It's been fantastic having you up here on the stage. Thank you so much for all your contributions. I'm now going to invite our audience to give you a very big thank you. And I'm going to thank you, and I'm going to ask you to gracefully exit the stage because we're coming to a close of FFA. So if you wouldn't mind, lady and gentlemen,